Hi everybody. So I hope that before you started watching this video, you went ahead and watched week 8's video 1. If you haven't, go back and watch that and then come back here and watch this video next. So this week we're going to learn about the Industrial Revolution. Now the Industrial Revolution is probably one of the most impactful things that has happened in our world ever. It was a time when people that started off as farmers were having to move to cities to get jobs because the farming work wasn't there. Sometimes farm owners would have 8 sons, and they divide up their property 8 ways. Then they'd have 8 more sons, and they divide the properties 8 ways. And eventually, there was no land for the younger siblings. Also, improvements in technology in farming meant that less workers were required. At the same time, cottage industries like textiles, like the making of fabrics and the making of clothing, were moving from homes into factories because factories could produce massive quantities of fabric in much less time than it took for one person sitting in a home using a spinning wheel. Factor in also a whole number of other factors, such as coal was plentiful in England, and coal was used to fuel the factories that would produce these goods. Improvements in transportation, like with railroads and shipping, allowed for people to make goods in England and then sell them all over England, or even better yet, all over the world. There was also, money, more liquid assets. People that could accumulate more money and become rich that way rather than accumulating land. And in fact, this was a time when money was becoming more desirable than having massive tracts of land. Banking improvements. There were a lot of things that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Now, the good side of this is that we live the life we live now because of, the changes that the Industrial Revolution brought into the world. We all live more comfortably than people lived back in the 1700s, say, or maybe even the early 1800s. We have our cell phones now. We have computers. Like, you can take this class on the internet now because of changes that the Industrial Revolution brought about. So without a doubt, I would much rather live today in the 21st century than I would have prior to there being an Industrial Revolution. The bad news is that this industrialization had a very negative, there's a dark side to it, let's put it that way. And one of the most horrifying developments of the Industrial Revolution was something called child labor, where children were put to work as young as 5 or 6 years old, doing very hard manual labor, oftentimes for very long hours in the day, for very minimum pay. And those children that worked in the mines even had it worse than the children that worked in factories because they worked in the dark and they had to deal with the rats down there in the mines. And these children were underfed. They were highly undernourished. Many of them would get injured, some of them permanently, or even killed as a result of having gone to work. And it wasn't until about the mid-1800s that people that were not working in the mines and factories started to become aware of the fact that, hey, England's children are being abused here. And it was a very abusive system. So how does that relate to this week's work? Well, first of all, I want you to go through the History Channel's little description of the Industrial Revolution, where you'll get more information about things I've already talked about, and then additional information I may have forgotten. And then read the Commissioner's report on the mines, and take note of how horrifying the working conditions for the children in those mines were, and how in the end, Mr. Franks, I believe is his name, issues a scathing report about, this is actually slavery is what this is. And then here's where art can sometimes make a big difference. Then you're going to read Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cry of the Children. Now, we read Elizabeth Barrett Browning last week when she wrote love poems to her husband, Robert Browning. But remember, when we started talking about Victorian issues, or the Victorian time period in the literature, Victorian issues often focused on, or Victorian literature often focused on the issues of the time, particularly political issues and social issues. Now, we saw the French Revolution during the Romanticism time, but authors like Charles Dickens and, in this case, Elizabeth Barrett Browning looked at the social ills in society and wrote about them in an effort to change things. Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Cry of the Children did motivate change, because not everybody read those commissioners' reports. But everybody read Elizabeth Barrett Browning because she was such a popular poet at the time. And they started seeing how she was describing the horrors of child labor from children's point of view most of the time. So, people are horrified that these kids were working in the dark. People are horrified that all these children heard all day were the wheels of the factories. People are horrified that these children lost faith in God because they would pray for deliverance from this horrible life and nothing would change. So, so as a result of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poem, changes were brought into the laws of the time, and eventually child labor would be phased out throughout the remainder of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. So, I want you to do all of that, take the quiz, write the paper where you're going to describe how, the two things work hand in hand. The Commissioner's Report and Elizabeth Barrett Brown's poem worked hand in hand to bring about real, tangible change. And then this week's discussion, even today, musicians, movie makers, actors and actresses, authors, they all write about social issues, and sometimes they bury them in their art. So this week's discussion board, think about somebody, whether it's a musician, a rap artist, a author, a filmmaker, an actor, whatever, that is talking about some kind of social issue in their art. And you're going to do that in discussion board. And I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to use the Hunger Games as an example. So that's what this week is. So bear in mind, we live a very comfortable life compared to what people lived in prior to the Industrial Revolution. And we certainly live a more comfortable life now than the poor, the working poor specifically, of the Industrial Revolution era, starting in about the late 1700s and going all the way through to about 1870 or somewhere thereabouts. And this is also still an issue because there's still child labor going on outside the United States in other countries. So think about all of this, and I hope that you see the relevance of this week's lesson and can apply it to today.